Your World at 10. Now today, Time Magazine's much-awaited Person of the Year special issue has hit the stands. And for those of you who haven't seen the issue or haven't plugged into the big debate on the net, Time's Person of the Year is Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg. But interestingly, readers of Time Magazine seem to have voted more in support for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Well, to talk about this choice, this pick between Zuckerberg and Assange, we're joined now from New York by Radhika Jones, Assistant Managing Editor of Time Magazine. Radhika, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. Did you expect it to be such a controversial pick? Why did you pick Zuckerberg? What is the process attached to this, considering that the word on the net is that there was several more people in support of Assange as opposed to Zuckerberg?
Well, it's always an editorial decision. We do a poll online because it's fun for readers and it's informative for us to see what people are thinking about. And certainly in the case of Julian Assange, he was very much in the news in the last 4 weeks. So that's what's on people's minds right now. But looking back over the whole year and looking forward in terms of how Facebook is changing the way that people relate to each other on a species-wide level, across the world, really permeating people's daily lives, their friendships, their relationships at work, their relationships with their family. We felt that Zuckerberg was a strong choice.
Why this year, Radhika? I know, and let me quote your editor, Rick Stengel, who said that Facebook is now the third largest country on earth and surely has more information about its citizens than any government does. Zuckerberg, a Harvard dropout, is its t-shirt wearing head of state. Of course it's a phenomenon, no one can deny that, but why this year as opposed to any other year? Does it have to do with the 550 million subscriber to Facebook, or does it have to do with any other assessment?
It has to do with that and more. Certainly, yes, this was a year that Facebook reached critical mass in its user population, hitting that 500 million mark. It's also the year that Facebook introduced what they call social plugins, those like buttons that you now see all over the internet. If you go to the New York Times, you can log into the Times with your Facebook account. So it's really changing the way that people use the internet because you sort of take your identity with you. It's become, Facebook is no longer just a website that you go to, it's sort of how you travel online. It's sort of like your passport. So we felt, again, that this was a sort of major shift in the ways that people relate to each other, relate to information, the news, all of those things. It was also a big year in the news for Mark Zuckerberg, who was criticized, for various ways in which the site didn't control its privacy settings as much as users would have liked. And it was the year that The Social Network was released, a movie that painted his character in a very particular light that got a lot of attention.
I understand you interviewed Mark for the issue. How did he react to this, considering, like as you pointed out, it's been quite an incredible year for him, the success and the critical mass of Facebook itself, a very critical movie that painted him in a not very flattering light, and then of course the Person of the Year mantle.
He was, he seemed very affected by it. He was funny. He said to us, I don't usually take much notice of this kind of thing, but this is a serious thing. It's not an award or an honor. The Person of the Year mantle has gone to people who are not necessarily heroes in the past, but it's a mark of how much an individual person can influence the world, and I think in that sense it did strike him as very significant. He is also very much not like the person you saw in the movie, and when you read Lev Grossman's profile of him that's in our issue, you'll see he's not a cold person, he's a very warm one. He's incredibly affable, energetic, focused, certainly very, very driven and extremely smart, but not at all socially awkward.
All right, is it always this controversial, the pick for the Person of the Year? I'm going to quote off some of the feedback you've got on your website, and I noticed that you've now stopped accepting comments. Maybe it is the avalanche of comments that you have got. But for instance, someone said, it's just another example of embedded journalism, shame on you, Time. Yet another person, only a mere 5 years after Facebook is invented, Time magazine notices it. Yup, you guys sure have your finger on the pulse. And the third one, and this I thought was interesting, Mark Zuckerberg had 18,353 303 votes. Julian Assange had 382,026 votes. Regardless of whether it's actually a democratic decision or not, you went against your readers because you're cowards. Did you expect this avalanche of response? Is it always this controversial every year?
There's always a controversy about Person of the Year. You can never please everybody with this kind of thing, and I think part of the fun of it, of this franchise that Time has been doing since the 1920s, is that people love to argue about it. Everybody has an opinion. A lot of people would have liked to see Lady Gaga be the Person of the Year. Again, we felt that Zuckerberg was a strong choice, and Julian Assange is a runner-up. We did a big story on him. He's a fascinating character. He's someone, we're covering the WikiLeaks story every week. He was on the cover of Time 2 weeks ago, so it's certainly not a story we are unaware of. In terms of a controversy, for us, when people react to it, that's great. We're happy to hear it.
I also noticed that in one of your essays, Radhika, Time points out that in its opinion, Zuckerberg and Assange are two sides of the same coin. When I'm told when you asked Zuckerberg what he thought of WikiLeaks, he said, well, at a very high level, some of the themes could be connected. What is it that you saw that was similar between these two now very iconic figures, but both of whom have approached the sort of the concept of openness very differently?
Well, that's exactly it. It's the concept of openness and transparency. Julian Assange takes that vision of the world and seems to want to achieve it by toppling certain kinds of institutions, governmental institutions, the U.S. State Department in the most recent case. For Mark Zuckerberg, the idea of openness and transparency is much more about individual connection, human connection. He looks out in the world, to use the word that Facebook has made into a verb, he looks out in the world and sees it full of friends, full of people that you might connect to. Facebook actually tracks connections between nations that in the political sphere are very hostile to each other. They track how many friendships are formed every day between Israelis and Palestinians, for example. So, there's sort of a difference in intent between Assange and Zuckerberg.
I'm sure you expected that in picking Zuckerberg over Assange, you would be accused of being politically correct. Did that influence your decision in any way? Because it clearly does seem, at least from all the coverage of the last few weeks, that Assange has become a very popular, very iconic figure across the world.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one thing that we thought about when we consider Julian Assange, and again, he is on the short list, so he's definitely a presence in this issue, is that in a way, it's the person who leaked all the information to him who really put it out into the world, and that's Private First Class Bradley Manning, who's in prison right now. Julian Assange has been a vehicle for this information, but one wonders how much longer it will go on. With Mark Zuckerberg, you have a clearer case of someone who has a long-range vision and is executing it. And you had read earlier someone critiquing us for just discovering Facebook. Well, of course, that's not true. We have written about Facebook for years. But again, this seemed to us to be the year that Zuckerberg and his project really reached a kind of critical mass. And it's also a year, and when you read the piece, you'll see this, where he's really shifting. For him, the building of Facebook and the expansion of it is just the beginning of a larger project that he has in mind, where this idea that it's your social network and your friends who help determine the news that you read, the information that you get, the things that you like, that this will become more and more a way that we live our lives. You can imagine your friend network sort of being the organizing principle of the television shows that you watch. You can imagine having a GPS system in your car that's linked to your social network so that if I'm at a restaurant 5 blocks from you, you can find me and your car will take you to me. All those kinds of things. That's part of what Mark Zuckerberg has in mind for Facebook, and it's it may not appeal to everyone, but it's certainly a fascinating vision of what the world might look like in the next decades.
Maybe another year for Assange. A quick last question. I noticed on your runners-up list, you of course had Assange, you had the Tea Party movement, you had the Chilean miners, who of course have become heroic, but you also had Hamid Karzai. That's the only one I couldn't get. I got the Chilean miners, I got the Tea Party, I couldn't get Hamid Karzai. How come he made it to the runners-up list?
Well, as Joe Klein wrote in his wonderful piece on Karzai, it isn't so much in that case a question of distinction of character, but more that Karzai puts a face on this conflict in Afghanistan that is sort of a morass. It's the big foreign policy story of the year, certainly from the States, and like it or not, Hamid Karzai will probably direct the future of Afghanistan for some time, and those of us who have a vested interest in security and stability there will need to find a way to work with him.
Radhika, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us on Your World at 10. It promises to be an interesting issue of the time with a very detailed piece on Mark Zuckerberg. Thanks very much for joining us. With that, we need to